My name is Sadie Lang. I'm 33 years old. 6 days before Thanksgiving, my mother called to tell me not to come to dinner. Not because we'd fought, not because I'd done something wrong, because my brother Connor asked her to uninvite me. He told her my job would embarrass him in front of his girlfriend's family. I'm a structural welder and metal fabricator. I own an ironworks company. I build staircases out of raw steel plate. I climb scaffolding in a leather welding jacket with an arc flash burn scar on my left forearm. Connor works in wealth management at a private firm on the 17th floor of a glass tower downtown. He wears cufflinks. He talks about diversified portfolios and estate planning. My mother said, "You understand, don't you, sweetheart? This matters to Connor." I said, "I understand." I didn't tell her what my company actually does. I didn't tell her what it's actually worth. I didn't tell her that in 6 days, everything she thought she knew about her daughter was going to come apart in a ballroom full of 600 people. They didn't know the welder they were ashamed of had just been nominated for Fabricator of the Year by the largest metal trades association in the state. And what happened next would teach them that uninviting me to Thanksgiving wasn't their biggest mistake. Their biggest mistake was never once asking what I'd spent 10 years building. It started the way these things always start, quietly, at a kitchen table on an ordinary Sunday, when nobody in the room understood they were watching the first domino fall. I was 23. Sitting at my parents' dinner table in Littleton, Colorado, the same oak table we'd eaten at since I was 6, the one with the water ring near the salt shaker that never came out no matter how many times my mother sanded it. My father was watching the Broncos highlights with the sound off. My mother was folding napkins into triangles, the way she did when she needed her hands busy. Connor was 20 and home from CU Boulder for the weekend, scrolling his phone, half present the way 20-year-olds always are. I said, "I'm not finishing my business degree. I'm enrolling in the welding program at the trade school on Santa Fe." My mother's hands stopped mid-fold. My father muted a highlight he wasn't even watching, out of habit more than interest. "Welding," my mother repeated. Not a question, a verdict. "Structural fabrication," I said. "I start in January. 18 months, and I come out certified in 4 different processes. There's a shop in Commerce City that already offered me an apprenticeship." The silence sat there for maybe 6 seconds. It felt like a full minute. My mother said, "Pam's daughter just got into law school at DU. The Henderson's boy is doing his residency at Presbyterian St. Luke's." Not, "Tell me more," not, "Why welding?" Not even, "Are you sure?" Just a comparison. A scoreboard I hadn't agreed to play on. My father set the remote down. "Sadie, that's hard on your body. Physical labor. You've got a 3.7 GPA. You could do anything." "I want to build things," I said. "Real things. Things that hold weight." Connor looked up from his phone just long enough to say, "So, like, you're going to be a welder? For real?" Like I'd announced I was joining the circus. My mother reached over and put her hand on top of mine. "Honey, we just want you to have it easier than we did." She'd spent 26 years as an office manager at a dental practice. My father had spent 31 years doing inventory logistics for a regional grocery chain. They had worked hard, and they had decided somewhere along the way that hard work with your hands was something you escaped, not something you chose on purpose. College was the ladder out. I was standing at the bottom of that ladder telling them I didn't want to climb it, and they couldn't understand why anyone would walk away from a rung they'd spent their whole lives trying to reach. "This is what I want," I said. My mother smiled the smile she used when she decided not to fight, but hadn't actually let go of being disappointed. "Well, we'll support you," Of course we will. Support, I would learn over the next decade, came with an asterisk. It meant showing up. It meant not saying anything cruel to my face. It did not mean curiosity. It did not mean interest. It did not mean asking a single follow-up question about the thing I had chosen to spend my life doing. Every Sunday for 10 years, my parents asked Connor about his job. Every single Sunday. How's the firm treating you? Did you close that account? Are they still talking about making you VP before 30? Every Sunday they asked me, how's work? Not, what are you building right now? Not, how's the shop? Just the two flattest words in the English language, asked with the same tone you'd use to ask about the weather. Polite, disinterested, a box checked on the way to the real conversation. When I finished my apprenticeship and got my journeyman welding certification at 25, I told them at Sunday dinner. My mother said, "That's nice, sweetheart," and turned to ask Connor whether his firm was sending him to the Aspen conference again this year. When I got licensed as a general contractor specializing in structural steel 2 years later and told them over pot roast, my father said, "That's a big responsibility." And my mother said, "Just don't overextend yourself, honey. These small operations are risky." Then she asked Connor about his new company car. When I founded Lang Iron Works and Fabrication, LLC, at 28, filed the paperwork myself at a card table in my one-bedroom apartment, got the liability insurance, the business license, the whole legal skeleton of a real company, I told them at dinner. My father said, "You're really doing this." My mother said, "Just be careful." I stopped announcing things after that. I stopped waiting for the follow-up question that never came. But I didn't stop building. If anything, I built faster, like the silence was fuel instead of a wall. By year 5, Lang Iron Works had completed 51 projects across the Denver metro. We employed 14 people full-time, plus a rotating bench of subcontractors for the big jobs. Last year, we brought in $2.4 million in revenue. After payroll, materials, insurance, and overhead, I personally cleared $211,000. Connor made $88,000 as an associate wealth manager, plus bonus. Every Sunday, my mother asked him about his bonus structure. Every Sunday, she asked me, "How's work?" I stopped waiting for them to ask. I just kept building. It came on a Thursday night, November 13th, at 7:52 p.m. I'd just walked in from a job site in the Rhino Art District, a 110-year-old brick warehouse we were converting into a boutique hotel and event space, where I'd spent the day up on a lift, running a bead along a steel header 22 feet above a concrete floor. My jacket still smelled like ozone and hot metal. There was a burn hole the size of a dime in the cuff of my thermal shirt from a spark that had jumped my glove. I saw my mother's name on the screen and almost let it go to voicemail. Thursday wasn't a calling night. We talked on Sundays when Connor came for dinner, and even then it was mostly small talk over a table I no longer had much to say at. "Hey, Mom." "Hi, sweetie." Her voice had that careful pitch to it, the one she used right before she said something she'd rehearsed. "How are you?" "Good. Just got home." "What's up?" A pause. I heard her inhale. "So, Thanksgiving," she said. "I need to talk to you about Thanksgiving." I set my keys on the counter. "Okay." "Connor's bringing Bree this year. You know, his girlfriend? It's the first time he's bringing her around the whole family, and he's nervous. He asked if maybe, just this year, we could keep it small, immediate family only. Him, Bree, me, your father." I didn't say anything for a second. I was doing the math on what I was actually hearing. "Sadie?" I am immediate family, I said. I know, honey, I know. It's just, Connor feels like this is important. He wants to make a good first impression, and he's worried that... Worried that what? Another pause, longer this time. He said your job might be a little hard to explain. To Bree's family. They're very established, Sadie. Old Denver money. Her father's on the board of 2 banks, and Connor's worried they'll take one look at what I do for a living. He didn't mean it the way it sounds. What did he say, Mom? Word for word. She hesitated, and I could picture her exact expression, the one where her mouth tightens and her eyes go somewhere over my left shoulder, even though we were on the phone and she couldn't see me at all. He said you're a welder, and that Bree's family wouldn't understand, and he doesn't want them thinking we're... She stopped. Blue collar, I said. Say it. He said blue collar like it's a diagnosis. He didn't say it like that, but that's what he meant. My mother sighed, the exhale she'd been doing since I was 23 and told her I was dropping out of a business degree to learn how to weld. Sweetheart, you understand, don't you? This could be it for Connor. Bree might be the one. He just wants everything to go smoothly for once. I looked down at my hands. There was a fresh burn blister forming on the pad of my thumb, and grinder dust ground into the creases of my knuckles that no amount of soap would get out before morning. I'd been on that lift since 6 a.m. So I'm uninvited, I said, quiet. It's just this year. We'll do Christmas together, all of us, or brunch, just the 2 of us before then. Would that be okay? Sure, I said. It's fine, Mom. Thank you for being so understanding about this. Relief flooded into her voice, fast and unmistakable. The kind of relief that told me she'd been dreading this call far more than I'd been dreading receiving it. I knew you'd get it. I did get it. I understood exactly what this was. I'd understood it for 10 years, actually. This was just the first time it had a shape I couldn't pretend not to see. We said our goodbyes. I hung up and stood in my kitchen in my work jacket, sawdust and weld smoke still clinging to the collar, and I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything. I just stood there in the quiet, running my thumb over the fresh blister, wondering exactly when I'd become the thing my own family needed to hide from people they wanted to impress. Outside, it had started to snow. The first real snow of the season, fat flakes drifting sideways under the streetlight. Thanksgiving was 10 days away, the season of gratitude, and I'd just been told, gently, politely, with an apology built right into the delivery, that I wasn't welcome at my own family's table. I hung my jacket by the door. My boots sat beneath it, scuffed at the toes, one lace replaced with paracord because the original had snapped on a job site in August, and I'd never gotten around to buying a new one. This is who I am, I thought, and it still isn't enough. They never asked. So they never knew that every Sunday, while Connor talked about his book of clients and his year-end bonus target, I was quietly out-earning him almost 3-to-1. They never knew what Lang Ironworks had actually become. Not the real numbers. Not the real size of it. I started Lang Ironworks and Fabrication in April, 5 years ago. I was 28. Before that, I'd spent 3 years as a lead fabricator for a company called Redline Steel, a mid-sized structural shop that did commercial build-outs across the Front Range. I was good at it. I could read a structural engineer's stamped drawings the way some people read novels, cover to cover, no skimming. I knew how to run a crew, how to keep a job on schedule when the steel delivery got delayed 6 weeks because of a mill strike in Indiana, how to talk a nervous general contractor off a ledge when an inspection didn't go the way anyone wanted. But I wanted something that was mine. So I filed the LLC paperwork on a Tuesday during my lunch break, sitting in my truck in the Red Line parking lot. I got the general liability policy, $2 million in coverage, $5,200 a year, a number that made my stomach drop every time I wrote the check for the first 2 years. I bought a used Ford F350 for $41,000, paid mostly in cash from 4 years of saving every bonus and overtime check I'd ever gotten, plus a small loan I paid off in 11 months. I had a logo made, a simple word mark, an L folded into an I-beam cross-section, and had it vinyl cut onto both truck doors. Small, clean, just the name and a phone number. At Sunday dinner, I told my parents. I started a company, I said. Lang Ironworks, structural steel and architectural metalwork. My father looked up from his plate. Your own company? Yeah. My mother smiled. That's nice, honey. Then, to Connor, how's the training program going? Did they assign you a mentor yet? By the end of year 2, I'd completed 19 projects, mostly small commercial work, a spiral staircase for a downtown coffee roaster, custom railing systems for 2 apartment buildings, a steel and glass storefront for a boutique on Larimer Street that got photographed for a design blog and brought me 3 more clients off the strength of that one write-up. I hired my first full-time employee that year, Tomas Reyes, 44 years old, a master fabricator who'd spent 2 decades doing ornamental ironwork before the recession gutted half the shops he'd worked for. He could lay a weld so clean it looked machine-milled, and he had an eye for proportion that no engineering degree could teach. I told my parents at dinner. I hired someone, Tomas. He's been doing this longer than I've been alive, basically. That's wonderful, sweetheart, my mother said, and turned to Connor. Did you hear back about the promotion? Year 3 was the year everything changed shape. I landed a $310,000 contract to do the full structural steel package for a 5-story mixed-use building in the Baker neighborhood. Mezzanine framing, a monumental staircase, exposed steel ceiling trusses the architect wanted left raw and unpainted, on display. It was the biggest job I'd ever taken. I was terrified. I was also, somehow, exactly ready. The project ran 6 months. We came in 11 days ahead of schedule and $14,000 under budget, mostly because Tomas found a way to reuse off-cut plate steel for a secondary staircase instead of ordering new material. The developer cried a little when we walked the finished space with him. He referred us to 2 other developers within the month. By the end of that year, I had 5 employees. Revenue crossed $1.1 million for the first time. I didn't give my parents the number. I just said, "Business is going well." My mother said, "That's wonderful, honey." My father said, "Just make sure you're setting some aside for retirement." Connor said, "I got put on the Ferris account. It's like $40 million in assets under management." My mother's face did something it had never once done for me. It lit up, unguarded, proud, without hesitation. Year 4, I hired a project manager, a second full-time welder, and a part-time bookkeeper named Priya, who saved me roughly 11 hours a week and probably a small heart attack. I moved out of my apartment and bought a fixer-upper bungalow in the Berkeley neighborhood. 1,340 square feet, a foundation issue the inspector flagged twice, a kitchen that hadn't been touched since the Carter administration. I renovated most of it myself over 8 months, doing the structural and metalwork personally and subbing out the rest. New kitchen, refinished floors, a custom steel staircase railing I built in my own shop after hours, because I could. I paid $312,000 for the house. It appraised at $398,000 after the work was done. My parents came to see it exactly once. My mother walked through slowly, touching the countertops. "It's charming," she said. "A little small, but charming." My father asked, "You did the railing yourself?" "Every welt," I said. "Huh," he said, and that was the whole conversation. We didn't stay long after that. This year, Lang Iron Works is on track to close at $2.4 million in revenue. 14 full-time employees, 6 active projects, 51 completed jobs in our portfolio since day one. Average project value, $94,000. Our biggest job to date, the one that would end up changing everything, was a $460,000 steel package for a historic warehouse conversion in Rhino. A 110-year-old brick building being turned into a boutique hotel, restaurant, and event venue called the Ironclad. That project needed an interior designer who understood how to work alongside raw structural steel instead of hiding it. I found her name through a supplier rep who'd worked with her on a restaurant build-out in the Highlands. Her name was Bree Sinclair. I emailed her in June. "Hi, Bree. I'm S. Lang, owner of Lang Iron Works. We're doing the full structural steel scope for the Ironclad, a warehouse conversion in Rhino. Roughly $460,000 in exposed steel, staircases, and mezzanine work. I'd love to bring in a designer who knows how to work with raw material instead of covering it up. Would you have time for a call next week?" She replied in 90 minutes. "S. Lang, I'd love to talk. I have an opening Tuesday at 9 or Thursday at 1. Looking forward to it. Bree Sinclair, Principal Designer." We met on site for the first time on a Tuesday in late June. She showed up in tailored linen trousers and boots that were clearly nicer than anything that belonged on a construction floor, carrying a leather portfolio and a laser measure. She was 29, sharp, unhurried in the way people are when they're actually good at their job and don't need to prove it. She walked the building with me for 2 hours, asking real questions, load paths, whether we were keeping the original riveted columns exposed, whether the mezzanine could handle the weight of a planned rooftop bar's mechanical units. "I love this building," she said, standing under a bay of original steel trusses, tilting her head back to look at them. "This is the kind of project I got into design for." "Good," I said, "because I need someone who's not going to want to drywall over everything my crew works this hard to build." We signed the contract 2 weeks later. $34,000 for full design services on the public spaces. She never asked to meet the owner in person before that first site walk. She'd seen S. Lang, owner, on the email signature in the contract, and that had been enough. She had no reason to think S. Lang was a woman, and even less reason to think S. Lang was the sister of the guy she'd started seeing that same summer. On site, I wore Carhartts and a flannel under my welding jacket, hair shoved up under a hard hat, a respirator hanging around my neck most of the day. I carried a tape measure and a set of stamped drawings rolled under one arm. Bree, I found out much later, had assumed for the first 6 weeks that I was the site super, or maybe the project manager. She never asked directly. I never corrected her. It wasn't dishonesty, exactly. It was just 2 people talking about steel and skylights, not resumes. In late August, we were standing in what would eventually be the hotel's lobby, arguing pleasantly about whether the staircase railing should be blackened steel or left in a raw mill finish, when she mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd started seeing someone. "That's great," I said, only half listening, running a finger along a sample of blackened steel Tomas had brought over that morning. "He's in finance," she said. "Wealth management, actually. Downtown." "Nice," I said, and didn't ask his name. "Professional boundary. not my business. She didn't offer it. I didn't ask. Neither of us knew in that moment, standing under $200,000 worth of exposed structural steel, that the boyfriend she was talking about was my brother. I didn't know that when Connor talked about me at all, he called me my sister, she's in construction, and changed the subject. I didn't know he'd told Bree I was the family's black sheep, the one who never quite got it together. I didn't know that when Bree pictured construction, she pictured someone hauling drywall, not someone who'd signed her $34,000 invoice from a business account with $2.4 million a year running through it. They never asked, so they never knew. And that decade of nobody asking, nobody looking one layer past the surface, was about to collapse in the worst possible way in front of the worst possible number of people. The math, looking back, was almost embarrassingly simple. Bree started working with me in June. She started dating a guy in finance sometime in July. By November, it was serious enough that he was bringing her home for Thanksgiving to meet the whole family. But I never connected any of it, because I never talked to Connor about my work, and he never talked to me about his life either. Our Sunday conversations had flattened into small talk years earlier. How's work? Fine. How's the bank? Fine. Pot roast and silence in between. And Bree was a professional contact. We talked about patina finishes and whether the original brick could handle anchor bolts without cracking. We did not talk about our personal lives. Not really. Not until it was already too late for it to matter. So when my mother told me Connor was bringing his girlfriend Bree to Thanksgiving, the name didn't register as anything. Bree is not an uncommon name. And when my mother uninvited me because Connor didn't want his girlfriend's old money family finding out his sister welded for a living, I didn't think, even once, about the designer I'd hired in June. I just thought about the plain fact that my own family was ashamed enough of me to rearrange a holiday around hiding me. Bree told me later, weeks later, after everything had already come apart in public, that Connor had been strange about his family from the very start. He never wanted to talk about you, she said. I'd ask about his sister and he'd say, she's in construction, and then change the subject so fast it was almost funny. I figured there was some old sibling thing. I didn't think... She stopped there. Both times she tried to finish that sentence for weeks. Thanksgiving fell on a Thursday. I woke up at 5:40 in the morning out of pure habit, made coffee in my French press, black, no sugar, and stood at my kitchen window watching the sky go from navy to gray over the Berkeley neighborhood. 31 degrees outside, clear. The cottonwood in my backyard was bare, its branches stark against a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to snow. It was Thanksgiving, and I had nowhere to be. I thought about calling a friend. I thought about finding a diner that stayed open, sitting at the counter, ordering turkey off a laminated menu like it was any other Thursday. Instead, I put on my work clothes, thermal shirt, Carhartts, my leather jacket, and drove to the Ironclad. We were close to finished on the interior steel, just detail welds left on the mezzanine railing and some final grinding on the staircase stringers before the powder coat crew came through the following week. The client wanted a soft opening by mid-January, and we were on pace. I parked in the empty lot at 6:50. The street was silent. Everyone else in the city was home or on their way somewhere, ovens preheating, tables being set. I let myself in through the side door. The building smelled like cut steel and fresh weld primer, and the exposed trusses caught the low morning light coming through the skylights we'd framed in July. We had done good work here, the kind of work that would outlast every person who ever set foot in the finished hotel. I spent the morning on the mezzanine railing, grinding welds smooth, checking penetration on a section Tomas had flagged the week before, The kind of slow, careful work that needs full attention and gives you nothing back but the quiet satisfaction of a clean line. I worked until 3, then sat on an overturned 5-gallon bucket near the loading dock, eating leftover pad thai I'd picked up the night before. $16.80, extra spicy, mostly cold by the time I got to it, and watched the light shift across Larimer Street through the open bay door. My phone buzzed. A text from Connor. Happy Thanksgiving. I looked at it for a long time. Not wish you were here. Not, I'm sorry about this. Just 4 words. The bare legal minimum of a family relationship. I didn't answer. I finished my food, threw the container away, locked up the building, and drove home. Every house on my street had cars stacked 3 deep in the driveway, warm lights spilling out of windows, the outlines of families moving around inside. I went in, showered, put on sweatpants, and sat on my couch with a laptop. I answered emails. I reviewed next week's crew schedule. I updated the material budget on the ironclad job. At 8:15, I closed the laptop and went to bed. I didn't feel sorry for myself. I felt, strangely, free. For the first time in 10 years, I wasn't sitting at that oak table performing patience while my parents asked Connor about his year-end numbers and asked me, in the same breath, how work was, like the 2 questions belonged on the same scale. I wasn't there, and I was fine. Better than fine. I was building something they couldn't see, and for one night, I stopped needing them to see it. In 5 days, they'd see it anyway, whether they wanted to or not. I'd known about the nomination for 2 months. The email came in late September from the Colorado Metal Trades Association, the state's largest professional body for structural and ornamental steel workers, fabricators, and shop owners. I read it 3 times, certain I'd misread a name somewhere. Dear Ms. Lang, on behalf of the CMTA Awards Committee, we are pleased to inform you that you have been nominated for Fabricator of the Year, Under 35, in recognition of your work at Lang Ironworks and Fabrication. Someone had put my name forward. I found out much later it was the developer from the Baker Street project, the one who'd cried a little walking through his finished building 2 years earlier. The committee had reviewed the submission, checked references, looked at the portfolio, and I'd made the short list of 3. I hadn't told my parents. I hadn't told almost anyone, actually, except Tomas, who hugged me so hard in the middle of the shop floor that he knocked a box of welding rods off the workbench, and Priya, who immediately started drafting a press release I told her we absolutely were not sending out yet. The awards gala was set for Tuesday, December 2nd, at the Brown Palace Hotel downtown. 600 people, black tie optional, the biggest night on the metal trades calendar in the entire state. Every major fabrication shop, every structural engineering firm, every developer who'd built anything out of steel in the last decade would have a table there. So would every bank and financial firm that sponsored the trades in Colorado, because that's how these things work. Construction money and finance money end up in the same room eventually, whether either side plans it or not. I didn't know, walking in, that Connor's firm was one of the event's sponsors. I didn't know he'd get 4 tickets. I didn't know exactly who he'd bring. I arrived at 6:20. The Brown Palace's ballroom entrance was already crowded, valet line backed up onto Tremont, everyone in dark suits and cocktail dresses filing in under the hotel's old brass chandeliers. I parked my own truck 3 blocks away in a garage because I refused to pay $38 for valet on principle, and walked the rest of the way in heels I'd bought for exactly one prior occasion, a client dinner 8 months earlier, and had barely broken in. I checked my reflection in the truck's side mirror before I locked it. Black dress, hair down and straightened instead of shoved under a hard hat, a thin gold necklace instead of a respirator strap. I looked like someone else entirely. Not the woman with grinder dust ground into her knuckles. Not the woman who'd spent that morning running a torch along a steel plate in 28-degree weather. I looked polished, composed, almost unrecognizable to myself. And I hated a little that it mattered to me how I looked walking into that room. But it did. Inside, the lobby was loud with the specific noise of an industry that doesn't often get dressed up. Laughter a little too big, drinks held a little too carefully. I saw a supplier rep I recognized from a steel yard in Commerce City and waved. He waved back, did a double take, and mouthed, "Wow," at the dress. I laughed it off and kept walking. Registration was a long table staffed by volunteers in CMTA polos. A woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain found my name on the list, handed me a lanyard, and said, "Sadie Lang, nominee. Good luck tonight, hun." "Thanks," I said, and pinned it on and walked into the ballroom. It was enormous. Round tables for 10, white linen, centerpieces of dried wheat and copper-colored flowers that someone clearly thought looked industrial chic. A stage at the front held a podium and a screen with the CMTA logo rotating slowly through sponsor names. I found my seat at table 6, the nominees table, and sat down next to two men I recognized from a regional trades conference 2 years earlier. We made small talk about the rubber chicken we could already smell coming out of the kitchen. Someone made a joke about whether the open bar would run out before the awards did. Everyone laughed a little too hard because everyone was nervous in exactly the same way. I opened the program booklet on my plate. Colorado Metal Trades Association, 41st Annual Excellence Awards, December 2nd. A full page listing categories: Lifetime Achievement, Rising Shop of the Year, Safety Excellence, and, on page 5, Fabricator of the Year, under 35. 3 names listed underneath. Mine was the second one. This was real. I was actually here, in a ballroom with 600 people, one of 3 finalists for the biggest recognition in my entire field, and no one in my family knew. I looked up and scanned the room out of pure reflex, the way you check and exit when you walk into any large space. And then I saw them. Table 41, roughly 60 feet from the stage, clear sightline to the podium. Connor, in a navy suit I didn't recognize. My mother, in a wine-colored dress I'd never seen before. My father, visibly uncomfortable in a tie he probably hadn't worn since my cousin's wedding. And next to Connor, in a black cocktail dress, hair swept back, laughing at something he'd just said. Bree. My stomach dropped somewhere near the floor. Connor's firm sponsored the event. He must have gotten a table through work, and instead of colleagues, he'd filled it with the people he wanted Bree to see him surrounded by. His parents, presentable and proud, in a room full of the kind of quiet, established Denver money her family understood. He had no idea I was 50 feet away. Neither did she. This was about to get complicated in a way none of them could see coming yet. Dinner service started at 6:50. Chicken, exactly as rumored, dry enough to require the accompanying sauce just to get it down. I ate mechanically, mostly to have something to do with my hands, and watched table 41 out of the corner of my eye without meaning to. My mother touched Bree's arm and said something that made Bree smile, easy and warm. My father nodded along to whatever Connor was saying. Connor looked, for lack of a better word, proud. His girlfriend charmed by his parents dressed up and impressed by the ballroom, by the sponsor logo on the screen with his firm's name on it, by every visible marker of the life he'd built. None of them looked toward table 6, not once. Why would they? As far as they knew, I was home alone, or out with friends, or anywhere at all except 60 feet from where they sat. At 7:20, the association's president took the stage, a woman in a red blazer with the particular confidence of someone who'd run this event for a decade. "Good evening, everyone," she said, and the room settled. "Welcome to the 41st Annual CMTA Excellence Awards. Tonight, we celebrate the people who quite literally hold this state together." A ripple of laughter, the kind you get from an audience of structural engineers who genuinely think that's funny. She thanked the sponsors. When she said the name of Connor's firm, I saw him straighten in his chair 60 feet away, visibly pleased, and lean over to say something to Bree. "We've got a wonderful program tonight, recognizing excellence across the trades, safety, craftsmanship, and the people carrying this industry into its next generation. But let's start," she said, "with a category close to my heart. Fabricator of the Year, under 35. My pulse spiked so hard I could feel it in my ears. This year's committee reviewed an incredible field of nominees, but 3 stood out for the scale, the craftsmanship, and frankly, the sheer nerve of what they've built before the age of 35. She read a short description of the first nominee. Applause, polite and warm. She read the second nominee's description, a shop up in Fort Collins doing custom agricultural fabrication. Then she said, "And our third nominee has, in 5 years, built her own structural fabrication company from a used pickup truck and a business card into a $2.4 million operation, employing 14 people with 51 completed projects across the metro area, including the steel package for the very building where next year's ironclad hotel and event space will open its doors." My hands went cold. "Please welcome, from Lang Ironworks and Fabrication, Sadie Lang." The room applauded. I stood up on legs that didn't feel entirely like mine and walked toward the stage. And as I crossed in front of the tables near the front, I heard it happen before I even saw it. A chair scraping back hard enough to be audible over the applause. I looked toward the sound without meaning to. Bree was standing at table 41, one hand pressed flat against her mouth, staring at me the way you stare at something that doesn't make sense yet, but is about to. I made it to the stage on autopilot. The association president shook my hand, pressed a crystal award shaped like an I-beam into my palm, and gestured toward the podium microphone with the easy confidence of someone who does this every year and has no idea she's just detonated a bomb in the middle of a family 60 feet away. I don't remember every word I said. I remember thanking Tomas by name and getting a little choked up doing it, because he'd believed in this company back when it was 1 truck and 1 folding table. I remember saying something about how the trades don't get talked about enough at dinner tables, about how a lot of us grow up hearing that working with your hands is a fallback instead of a choice, and how I hoped every kid in a welding program somewhere was hearing, tonight, that it wasn't. The room applauded again, warmer this time, the kind of applause that isn't polite anymore. It's real. I looked up once, mid-speech, and found table 41 again. My mother had her hand pressed to her chest. My father's mouth was slightly open. Connor was staring at me like I'd materialized out of thin air in a black dress holding a crystal trophy, which, from where he was sitting, was more or less exactly what had happened. And Bree was still standing. Not clapping, just standing, both hands over her mouth now, looking back and forth between me on that stage and Connor beside her, doing the math in real time, watching a year's worth of disconnected facts slam into a single, unbearable sentence. The site supervisor I've been talking to about steel finishes for 6 months is Connor's sister. And Connor's sister is the woman his family didn't want at Thanksgiving. And I am currently sitting at a table paid for by his firm, wearing a dress his mother complimented an hour ago, and none of them told me any of this. I finished the speech. I walked off the stage to applause I barely heard over the sound of my own pulse, sat back down at table 6, and set the crystal I-beam on the tablecloth in front of me with hands that weren't entirely steady. For about 4 minutes, nothing happened. The program moved on to the next award. I stared at my plate. Then I felt someone approaching from the side, and I looked up, and it was Bree, walking fast across the ballroom in her heels, weaving between tables, her face doing something between shock and something that looked almost like grief. She started, standing at the edge of table 6, ignoring the 2 nominees I was sitting between, ignoring the entire rest of the room. You're Sadie. Yeah, I said. S. Lang. Owner. You're Connor's Sadie, his sister. You're the one who... She pressed her fingers against her forehead like she was trying to physically hold her thoughts together. I've been on job sites with you for 6 months. I didn't know you were the owner. I didn't know you were his sister. He told me your name once, months ago, and I never connected it because why would I? He never talks about you, and I thought... You thought I was the site super, I said. I know. I never corrected you. That's on me too. He said you were in construction, she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the word construction, like it had suddenly become a much heavier word than it used to be. He made it sound like you were struggling, like you were the family disappointment. He told me his family didn't want me meeting you yet because things were complicated with you. She looked genuinely stricken. Sadie, he uninvited you from Thanksgiving because of me? Because of what he thought you'd think of me, I said. Which, it turns out, was wrong, but he never gave either of us the chance to find that out. Bree turned around slowly and looked back toward table 41, where Connor was now on his feet, my parents frozen beside him, the 3 of them clearly having some kind of frantic, hushed argument nobody at the surrounding tables could hear, but everyone could see. I need to go talk to him, she said. Then, to me, quieter. For what it's worth, that speech was the best thing I've heard all year. I'm so sorry. I had no idea. She walked back across the ballroom. I watched her reach the table, watched her say something to Connor that made him go visibly pale, watched my mother reach out a hand toward Bree that Bree stepped back from, just slightly, just enough for it to register as a flinch and not an accident. I sat at table 6, next to 2 men in rented tuxedos, a crystal I-beam trophy catching the chandelier light in front of me, and watched my family's carefully arranged evening come apart from 60 feet away. I left before dessert. I didn't want the rest of the ceremony. Didn't want the milling small talk after. Didn't want to be in that room for whatever happened next at table 41. I collected my coat, thanked the woman at registration on my way out, and walked the 3 blocks back to the parking garage in the cold, trophy tucked under one arm like a football. I was unlocking my truck when I heard footsteps behind me, fast, and my mother's voice. Sadie, wait! I turned around. She was out of breath, her coat unbuttoned, mascara starting to smudge at the corner of one eye. Behind her, 30 feet back near the garage elevator, Connor stood with his hands shoved in his pockets, not coming closer, watching. Why didn't you tell us? My mother said. Any of it. The company, the qual, the millions, Sadie. She said $2.4 million from that stage. Why would you let us think? Let you think what, Mom? I didn't let you think anything. You never asked. Not once in 5 years did you or Dad ask me a single real question about my company. You asked Connor about his bonus every single Sunday. You asked me how work was, like I was a stranger at a bus stop. That's not fair. It's exactly fair. I told you at that table, more than once, when things happened. I got my license, you told me to be careful. I started the company, you told me it was risky. I bought a house, you called it charming and small. I never hid the truth from you. You just never once looked closely enough to find it. My mother's face crumpled. I didn't know how to talk to you about it. I don't understand welding, Sadie. I don't understand any of it. I understand Connor's job because it looks like the life I always pictured for both of you. I didn't know how to ask questions about yours without it feeling like I was admitting I didn't approve. And I do approve. I didn't know how to say it. You didn't have to understand steel, I said. You just had to ask. How's work isn't a question, Mom. It's a door closing. She didn't have an answer for that. Behind her, Connor finally started walking over, slow, like a man approaching something that might go off. Sadie, he said, I didn't know. About any of it. The award, the money, none of it. I swear I didn't know. You didn't need to know the number to know it was wrong to uninvite your own sister from Thanksgiving because you were embarrassed of her, I said. The number isn't the point, Connor. You'd have done the exact same thing if I made $40,000 a year sweeping a shop floor. That's what actually happened here. You didn't find out I was successful tonight. You found out I was successful, and now it's inconvenient for you to have been ashamed of me. He didn't say anything to that, because there wasn't anything to say to it that wasn't also true. Where's Bree? I asked. She left, he said. She said she needed space. She said... His jaw tightened. She said some things about me I probably deserved to hear. I nodded once and unlocked my truck. I have an early morning, I said. I'm glad you both came out. Genuinely. I hope Bree's family didn't get too much of a show. And I got in, and I drove home, and I did not cry until I was 3 blocks away, at a red light, alone. And even then, it only lasted about 90 seconds before I made myself stop. The trophy sat in the passenger seat the whole drive, catching streetlight through the windshield, and I kept glancing at it like I needed to confirm, over and over, that the night had actually happened the way I remembered it. My phone did not stop for the better part of a week. Friday morning, there were 3 missed calls from my mother, all before 8 a.m., and a text that just said, "Please call me when you can." I didn't call her back that day. I had a full crew on site at the Ironclad, a powder coat delivery to inspect, and a new client walkthrough scheduled for a mezzanine job in the Golden Triangle. A job, I would learn 2 weeks later, that had come to me directly because the client's wife had been at the gala and had gone home that night and looked up Lang Ironworks before she'd even taken her earrings out. Saturday, Connor texted, "Can we talk? Not about Thanksgiving. About everything." I didn't answer that one either. Not because I was trying to punish him, or not only because of that, but because I genuinely didn't know what I wanted to say yet. And I've learned the hard way that answering people before you know what you actually mean just gives them a version of you that isn't true. And then you spend months walking it back. Sunday, the day we would normally have had dinner together, nobody called at all. It was the first Sunday in 10 years that the phone stayed silent. and the silence told me more than any of the calls had. They didn't know what to do with a version of me they hadn't built themselves. Monday, my father texted. Just my father, on his own, which had never once happened in my adult life outside of a forwarded warranty email or a photo of a Broncos score. Saw the article in the Denver Business Journal. Proud of you, Sadie. I mean that. Dad. I sat in my truck in the shop parking lot and read that text 4 times. It was 11 words. It was more than he'd said to me about my career in a decade combined. I texted back, "Thanks, Dad." And then, because some door in me had cracked open a little, "It means something that you looked it up." He wrote back an hour later, "I should have looked a lot sooner. I'm sorry it took this." I didn't cry over that one either, but it was close. Tuesday, exactly a week after the gala, Bree called me. Not Connor, Bree. We met at a coffee shop in the Highlands, neutral ground, 10 in the morning on a weekday when neither of us technically should have had the time. She was already there when I arrived. 2 coffees on the table, one of them clearly a guess at what I'd order, a plain drip, black, that turned out to be exactly right. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said. "I almost didn't." I sat down. "But I've spent 6 months on job sites with you, and none of that was fake. The steel we picked, the finishes, the arguments about the staircase railing, that was real, even if we didn't know the whole context. I didn't want to lose that over something that isn't actually your fault." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I broke up with him, Connor, 2 days after the gala." I hadn't expected that, and I think it showed on my face because she kept talking before I could respond. "It wasn't only about you," she said. "It was about what it revealed. He spent 5 months telling me pieces of a story about his family that made his sister sound like a cautionary tale, and none of it was true. And worse than that, he knew it wasn't true. He knew exactly what you'd built. He watched you get nominated. He must have heard your name on some list somewhere, some industry thing, and he never said a word to me. And he still uninvited you from a holiday over what my parents might think." She shook her head. "I don't want to be with someone who'll erase a person to make himself look better in a room. That's not a small thing, Sadie. That's a pattern. I didn't want to find out 5 years from now that I was the one getting erased next." "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it, even though some small, human, unattractive part of me was relieved. "For what it's worth, none of this was a scheme. I never once thought about you and Connor being connected. I wasn't hiding from you on purpose." "I know." She smiled, small and tired. "I actually think that's the part that makes it worse, in a good way. You weren't performing anything, you were just working. I liked working with you before I knew any of this. I still like it now. I was hoping, honestly, that we could keep the professional relationship going. The Ironclad's not even open yet. There's still the restaurant build-out in the spring." "I'd like that," I said. And I did. We finished our coffee, 40 minutes start to finish, and when we stood up to leave, she hugged me, unprompted, and I let her. My mother asked to see me 2 days later, not a phone call this time, a text, careful and formal in a way that told me she'd drafted it more than once. "Would you have time for coffee this week? Just us. I'd like to talk, if you're willing." I almost said no. I sat with the message for a full day before I answered, because I wanted to make sure I was walking into that conversation as myself, not as the version of me that still, apparently after everything, wanted her mother's approval badly enough to swallow something that needed to be said. We met on a Thursday morning at a diner near her house, a place we used to go when I was a kid, back when going out for pancakes felt like an event instead of a habit. She was already in a booth when I got there, hands wrapped around a coffee mug she wasn't drinking from, and she looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I'd just gotten used to seeing her across a room instead of across a table. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Yeah." We ordered. Small talk about the weather lasted exactly as long as it took the waitress to walk away, and then my mother folded her hands on the table the way she used to when she was about to say something rehearsed. "I've been thinking about that night for a week straight," she said. "And I keep landing on the same thing over and over, and I don't know how to say it without it sounding like an excuse, so I'm just going to say it plainly. I didn't ask about your work because I was scared of what I'd find out." That wasn't what I expected. Scared of what? "That you were happier than I was," she said. "That you'd built something real doing exactly what you wanted. And I spent 26 years at a job I was fine at, not passionate about, because it was the responsible thing to do. And here you were, doing the thing everyone told you not to do, and it was working. It was working so much better than I ever let myself imagine it could. It was easier to say, 'Be careful,' than to sit across from you and feel like I'd have made a different choice at 23 if I'd had the nerve you had." I sat with that for a second. It wasn't the apology I'd been bracing for, and it landed heavier because of it. "That doesn't excuse 10 years of not asking a single real question, Mom." "No," she said, "it doesn't. I'm not trying to excuse it. I'm trying to explain it. Because I think if I don't explain it honestly, I'll just do some version of it again in a different shape. I was proud of Connor because his life looked like a life I understood and could brag about at church without having to explain anything. I didn't know how to brag about yours because I didn't understand it, and instead of learning, I just didn't ask. I let how's work do the job that real curiosity should have done. I know that now. I knew it a little before, but I know it in a way I can't unknow now." "So what happens now?" I asked. "Because I'm not interested in a version of this where you feel bad for a month and then Sunday dinners go right back to Connor's quarterly numbers and my two-word small talk. I've spent 10 years being polite about this. I'm done being polite about it." "I don't want that either," she said. "I want to actually know what you're building. I want to come see the hotel when it's finished. I want to understand what a mezzanine is, even if I have to ask you to explain it 4 times before it sticks. I know I don't get it back just by saying I'm sorry. I know that's going to take longer than one breakfast." "It is," I said. "But this is a start." "And your father, for what it's worth, has been talking about that trophy every single day since the gala. He looked up the Denver Business Journal himself. He's never done that for either of us before." I told her I knew. I told her about the text. She smiled at that, small, and for the first time in a long time, it looked like a smile that didn't have an asterisk attached to it. I didn't fully forgive anyone that week, or the week after. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't a door that swings open the moment someone says the right sentence. It's a process you get to control the pace of. And I'd earned the right to control mine. 2 weeks after the gala, I sent an email. To my parents, to Connor separately. Short, clear. I'd thought about every line of it for days before I let myself hit send. "I'm willing to rebuild this, but it has to look different going forward. 3 things, non-negotiable. 1. If you want me at family events, Invite me the same way you'd invite anyone, with real notice, not a phone call 5 days out with an excuse attached. And if I say no to something, respect the no without making me explain it. 2. If you want to know about my work, ask and mean it, not as a box to check before you move on to someone else's news. I will answer any real question. I will not perform an update just to fill silence. 3. I will not shrink this company or myself to make anyone comfortable at a dinner table. What I do for a living is not a secret to manage. If you're not able to be proud of it out loud, in front of people, the way you'd be proud of anything else, then I need you to be honest about that now, not 5 years from now. If you can agree to this, I'll see you at Christmas. My father replied within the hour, "Agreed, all of it. We'll do better." Claude, Dad. My mother replied that evening, "Thank you for giving us the chance to. I love you, Sadie." Connor's reply came separately, later that night. "I know I don't get to ask for much right now. Can I call you sometime? No pressure on when." I wrote back, "Not yet. Maybe in a few months. I need some distance first." "I understand," he wrote. "I'm sorry. For real. Not just for getting caught." I didn't respond to that one. I believed him, mostly. Belief and readiness are two different things, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise just to smooth over an email thread. Before any of this, before the gala, before Bree, before the terms I laid out in that email, there was a year I never told my family about at all. Because by the time it was over, I'd decided the whole point of surviving it was that nobody got to use it against me later. It happened between year 3 and year 4, in the gap most people don't see when they look at a 5-year arc and assume it was a straight climbing line. It wasn't. Nothing that's actually worth building is a straight line. We'd just finished the Baker Street job, the $310,000 project that made my name mean something in certain rooms for the first time. I'd taken on a second big contract almost immediately after, overconfident in the way you get after your first real win. A $275,000 steel package for a mixed-use development in Englewood, a general contractor I didn't know well enough yet, and a payment schedule I should have negotiated harder. 3 months in, the GC's financing fell through. Not mine, theirs. The developer above them had a lending dispute that froze the whole project for 11 weeks. I had 2 employees on payroll, a shop lease, a truck payment, and $61,000 worth of ordered structural steel sitting in a yard in Commerce City that I'd already paid a deposit on, with no job to put it into and no incoming payment to cover the balance. I did not sleep more than 4 hours a night for most of that stretch. I ran the numbers on a legal pad at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning more times than I want to admit, trying to figure out whether I could make payroll for one more cycle, whether I needed to lay off the guy I'd hired 6 months earlier, a father of 2 named Danny, who'd left a warehouse job to come work for me because I'd promised him something more stable. I took out a $40,000 line of credit against the business, personally guaranteed, which meant if the company failed, it wasn't just the company that failed. It was my house, my truck, everything. I didn't tell my parents any of it. Not because I was protecting them from worry, if I'm honest. It was because some part of me already knew what would happen if I did. I could hear the conversation before it happened. See, this is why we worried. This is exactly the risk we were talking about. I couldn't survive that sentence, on top of everything else I was already carrying. So I simply didn't give them the chance to say it. I told Tomas. He was the only one who knew the full weight of it, because he was the one standing next to me in the shop at 7 a.m. when I had to tell him I might not be able to guarantee his hours past the next 30 days. He didn't quit. He didn't even flinch, not visibly. He said, "You built this from nothing once. You'll build it again if you have to. I'm not going anywhere." I have never forgotten that sentence, and I don't think I ever will. The project unfroze in week 12. The GC's financing came through 3 days before I would have had to make a decision about Danny's job that I genuinely did not know how I was going to live with either way. We finished the job. Slower than planned, tighter margin than I wanted, but finished, paid in full, 6 weeks late, but whole. I paid off the line of credit within 8 months. I never told my parents any of it happened, not during, not after, not even now, until this. Because somewhere in the middle of that 11-week freeze, lying awake doing math on a legal pad, I made a decision that I think ended up shaping everything that came after it. I decided I was going to build this company on my own foundation, not theirs. Their belief or their doubt wasn't going to be load-bearing in my life anymore. It could be there or not be there. Either way, the walls were going to stand. That's the part they still don't fully understand, even now, even after the trophy and the article and the apology emails. They think the turning point was one gala, one speech, one crystal eye beam under stage lights. It wasn't. The turning point was a legal pad at 2 a.m, 3 years earlier, when I chose to keep going without telling anyone how close it had come to not working. Because I'd already learned that their support had strings on it, and I wasn't willing to hand them a new one to pull. He showed up, unannounced, on a Wednesday in mid-December, 11 days after the gala, while I was in the middle of laying out a cut list for a railing job. I heard the side door of the shop open and looked up expecting Tomas back from a lumber run. And instead, it was my father, standing there in his good coat, looking around the shop like he'd walked into a foreign country. "I should have called first," he said. "You're here now," I said, and set down my tape measure. "Want the tour?" He nodded, and I walked him through it. The fabrication floor, the plasma table, the shelving system of steel stock organized by gauge and profile, the finished pieces waiting on pallets for delivery. He asked more questions in 40 minutes than he'd asked me in the previous 10 years combined. "What's this machine do? How thick is that plate? How do you know a weld's strong enough before you test it?" Simple questions, the kind a curious stranger asks, and I answered every one of them like they mattered, because for the first time, they did. Near the end, he stopped in front of a finished section of the ironclad mezzanine railing, staged in the shop before delivery. A long, curved run of blackened steel with a hand-hammered texture Tomas had spent 2 full days on. "You made this," he said. Not a question this time. Tomas did most of the texture work. I did the structural welds and the layout. "It's beautiful," he said, and ran his hand along it. "Careful, the way you touch something you're afraid might be too fragile for your hands, even though steel is about the least fragile material there is." I didn't know you could make something like this. I don't know what I thought. I thought it was just, framing, studs and nails. "A lot of people think that," I said. "It's part of why nobody in the trades gets asked about their work the way Connor gets asked about his. Nobody pictures this." He was quiet for a second. "I'm sorry, Sadie. I mean it. I don't have a good excuse. I stopped looking somewhere along the way, and I didn't notice I'd stopped." "I know, Dad. Can I come back sometime? I'd like to actually understand what you do, not just not just say I'm proud of it. I'd like to actually know what I'm proud of. Yeah, I said. You can come back. He did, twice more before Christmas. Once just to watch. Once because he genuinely wanted to help sweep the floor at the end of a shift, which made Tomas laugh so hard he had to sit down. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was small and slow, and it mattered more to me than the gala had, if I'm being completely honest, because the gala was 600 strangers finding out who I was. My father sweeping a shop floor was one person choosing, on purpose, to actually look. I should say something here about Tomas, because he shows up so often in this story that he deserves more than a passing mention, and because understanding him helps explain why I built the company the way I did. He was 42 when I hired him, laid off from a shop that had gone under 2 years earlier during a slow stretch in commercial construction, doing odd welding jobs out of a rented garage to keep his mortgage paid. He had 20 years of ornamental ironwork experience and a portfolio of photographs on his phone that made me actually gasp the first time he showed them to me. Gates, railings, a chapel door he'd forged by hand for a church in Pueblo that took him 4 months and that he still talked about like it was yesterday. I offered him a job at a wage that was, frankly, more than I could comfortably afford in year 2, because I looked at those photographs and understood immediately that I was looking at someone whose talent had simply never had the right person standing next to it, asking the right questions. Nobody had ever nominated Tomas for anything. Nobody had ever put his name in front of an awards committee. He'd spent 2 decades being excellent in near total obscurity, the way a lot of tradespeople do, because the industry that depends on their skill doesn't always bother to celebrate it. When I stood on that stage in December and thanked him by name, it wasn't a courtesy line in a speech. It was the truest sentence I said all night. Lang Ironworks doesn't exist without Tomas Reyes, and I have told him that more times than he'll ever fully believe, because men like Tomas were taught, the same way I was, that the work is supposed to be its own reward, and asking for recognition is somehow greedy. I've spent the last 2 years actively trying to unteach him that. I put his name on our website with his own bio, not just mine. I make sure every client walkthrough includes an introduction. This is Tomas. He did that texture work you're admiring. Not because he needs the ego boost, but because I know what it does to a person to spend 20 years unseen. And I wasn't going to run a company that repeated that pattern on someone else after living through a smaller version of it myself. Christmas fell on a Thursday that year. I drove to my parents' house at noon, alone this time. No Miguel equivalent +1, no statement to make, just me, in a green sweater instead of a black dress, hands still a little rough from a full week back at the shop. The house looked exactly the way it always had at Christmas. Lights strung along the porch railing, a wreath on the door my mother had made herself every year since I was a kid. My father's truck in the driveway with a thin layer of frost still on the windshield from the night before. My mother answered the door before I even knocked, like she'd been watching for my headlights. She hugged me hard, longer than usual, and said, "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," in a voice that didn't have any performance in it at all. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and roasting ham, the same smell it had smelled like every December of my childhood. My father was in the living room, untangling a string of lights that had clearly defeated him for the better part of an hour. Connor was on the couch, and when I walked in, our eyes met for the first time since the parking garage. He didn't smile. He nodded, small and careful, and I nodded back, and that was the whole exchange, and it was enough for a first Christmas back. We sat down to dinner at 1 o'clock. My parents, Connor, me, my Aunt Marisol, my Uncle Dave, 6 people around the same oak table with the water ring near the salt shaker that had never come out. The ham was good. My mother's mashed potatoes were lumpy, exactly the way they'd always been, and I found myself grateful for that, for the parts of this that hadn't had to change to make room for the parts that did. Halfway through the meal, my father set down his fork and said, "Sadie, how's the mezzanine job coming? The one in the Golden Triangle?" I looked at him. He was asking. Actually asking, the way you'd ask about anything you actually wanted to know. "Good," I said. "We poured the concrete deck last week. Steel goes up after New Year's. Should be done by March." "That's the building with the rooftop restaurant, right?" my mother asked. "I read about it. The one that used to be a printing warehouse?" "That's the one." "I'd love to see it when it's further along," she said, "if that's something I could do." I paused for a second because a year ago that sentence would have felt impossible coming out of her mouth, and now it just felt like a door opening the way doors are supposed to. "Yeah," I said, "I'd like that." Connor stayed mostly quiet through dinner, not sullen, just careful, the way you are when you know you're on probation and you'd rather listen than risk saying the wrong thing. Near the end of the meal, when my mother and aunt had cleared the table and my father and uncle had wandered off to watch football, he leaned over. "I talked to Bree last week," he said, "just to apologize properly, not to get back together. She was right about the pattern thing. I've been thinking about it a lot." "Good," I said. "That's good, Connor." "I'm not going to pretend I've got it all figured out," he said. "But I heard what you said in that email, about not asking me to shrink myself either. I don't actually know how to talk to you about your work, Sadie. I never learned how. I don't know the vocabulary." "You don't need vocabulary," I said. "You need to ask a question and actually wait for the answer, instead of already thinking about what you're going to say about the bank next." He almost smiled at that. "Fair." "How's the mezzanine built?" he said, like he was testing the sentence out loud for the first time. I laughed, actually laughed, the first real laugh I'd had around my brother in longer than I wanted to admit, and I told him. It took about 10 minutes, and he asked 2 follow-up questions that were actually decent, and it wasn't perfect, and it wasn't everything, but it was a beginning, in a house that had needed one for a very long time. At 3 o'clock, I stood up to leave. My mother looked surprised. "Already?" "Yeah, I've got an early morning tomorrow. We're back on site." It wasn't entirely true. The crew had the day off, but I needed to leave on my own schedule, the way I'd needed to leave the gala on my own schedule, because some part of rebuilding this relationship meant proving to myself more than to them that I still got to decide the terms. My mother walked me to the door. "Thank you for coming," she said, quiet. "Thank you for asking about the mezzanine," I said. She smiled and hugged me again, and this time I let myself hug her back without holding anything in reserve. It wasn't perfect. It was a start. The Denver Business Journal article ran the Monday after the gala, a 600-word profile with a photo of me standing in front of the Baker Street building, arms crossed, hard hat under one arm. It wasn't a huge piece. It ran on page 11, below a story about a proposed light rail extension. But it did something I didn't fully anticipate, which is that it started showing up in places I never expected, shared in a Facebook group for women in the trades, picked up by a regional contractor's newsletter, forwarded, apparently, by no fewer than 3 different people to my mother, who I later learned had printed it out and kept it in her kitchen drawer next to the takeout menus, which is either the most Denise Lang thing imaginable or the most touching, depending on how generous you're feeling. The business impact was real and immediate. In the 6 weeks after the gala, I fielded 11 new client inquiries, more than double our usual pace, including 2 developers who told me outright they'd been sitting on my name for months, unsure whether a 5-person outfit could handle a project their size. And the award had answered that question for them without me having to make the case myself. We signed 3 new contracts by the end of January, totaling just under $610,000 in projected revenue for the coming year, on top of what was already on the books. I hired 2 more people in January. A second-year apprentice named Ruby Okafor, 22, fresh out of the same trade school program on Santa Fe I'd gone through a decade earlier, and a part-time estimator to keep up with the volume of inbound bids. By February, Lang Ironworks had grown to 16 full-time employees, the largest the company had ever been. I also did something I'd been quietly turning over in my head for 2 years, and finally had both the capital and the nerve to actually start. I set up a small scholarship, funded out of company profit, covering tuition for 2 students a year in the same welding and fabrication program I'd graduated from, priority given to women and first-generation trade students, the exact demographic that had made up roughly 4% of my graduating cohort a decade earlier. I named it, with Tomas's blessing and more than a little embarrassment on my part, the Reyes Lang Trade Scholarship, because I wasn't willing to put only my name on something he'd made possible just as much as I had. The first 2 recipients started that fall. One of them was Ruby's younger cousin. Ruby Okafor showed up for her first day at Lang Ironworks in a pair of steel-toed boots that were clearly brand new, still stiff, the kind of boots that haven't yet learned the shape of the person wearing them. She was quiet the first week, the way you're quiet when you're the only woman on a floor of experienced tradesmen twice your age, and you're still figuring out whether you've earned the right to take up space in the room. I recognized the posture immediately, because I remembered wearing it myself. By her 3rd week, she'd stopped apologizing every time she asked a question, which I told her, directly, was the single most important professional skill she was going to learn that year, more important than any weld certification. "How did you know you wanted to do this?" she asked me one afternoon in March, both of us grinding welds on a railing section, sparks arcing off into the shop's dim afternoon light. "I didn't, exactly," I said. I knew I didn't want the life everyone around me assumed I should want. The wanting to weld part came later, once I actually tried it and realized I loved the specific feeling of making something permanent out of raw material. But the first push was mostly just refusing someone else's plan for me. "My mom still doesn't really get it," Ruby said. "She keeps asking when I'm going to do something with my associate's degree in business, like this doesn't count as doing something." I laughed because it landed a little too close to home. "Give it time," I said. "Some people need proof before they can offer belief. It's not fair and it shouldn't be a prerequisite, but I've found it's occasionally the only language certain people speak. Build the proof anyway. Not for them, for you. If the belief comes later, good. If it doesn't, you'll still have built something real, and that has to be enough on its own, because you can't spend your whole life waiting on someone else's applause to know your own work mattered." She was quiet for a second, then nodded, and went back to her weld. And I watched the bead she laid down, clean, steady, better than mine had been at that stage, and felt something settle in my chest that I didn't entirely have words for yet. The Ironclad Hotel and Event Space opened on a Friday in late April, 5 months after the gala, 7 months after Bree and I first met on that dusty concrete floor, arguing about staircase finishes. The opening was a proper event. 300 guests, a ribbon cutting, the developer giving a short speech thanking the trades that had made the building possible, my name included in that thank you, alongside Bree's and Tomas's, and half a dozen subcontractors who'd poured years into a building that had sat empty and half collapsing for over a decade before any of us touched it. I brought Ruby as my +1 because she'd earned it, having spent 3 solid weeks that winter grinding welds on the very mezzanine railing everyone was now admiring, with a glass of Prosecco in hand. My parents came. My mother wore the same wine-colored dress from the gala, which I noticed and didn't say anything about, though I think she noticed me noticing, because she touched the fabric self-consciously at one point and said, "I like this dress. I don't need a new one every time," which felt like its own small, unspoken apology for a version of pride that used to be about appearances and had, slowly, become about something steadier. My father spent 45 minutes doing what I can only describe as an unofficial guided tour for anyone who would listen, pointing out the exposed truss work, the mezzanine, the staircase, explaining load paths with roughly 60% accuracy and 100% enthusiasm, until I finally intervened to correct a fairly significant misstatement about how cantilevers work, which made him laugh so hard he had to sit down on one of the new lobby benches. Connor came alone. He found me near the bar about an hour in, 2 drinks in hand, and passed me one without asking what I wanted, which happened to be exactly what I would have ordered. "It's incredible, Sadie," he said, looking up at the trusses. "I mean it. I walked through the whole thing twice already." "Thanks. I've been seeing someone new," he said, a little awkward, like he wasn't sure whether that was information I wanted or a subject he should avoid entirely. "Her name's Priya, actually. No relation to your bookkeeper, before you ask. I checked." He paused. "I told her about you in the first conversation. Not my sister's in construction. I told her you own a $2.4 million fabrication company and you just won Fabricator of the Year. And she asked if she could meet you sometime, and I said yes before I even thought about it." "I'd like that," I said, and meant it. Bree found us a few minutes later in a green dress, glowing in the specific way people glow when they've just watched a year of their work become a physical place other people get to walk through and admire. She and Connor exchanged a brief, civil nod, not warm, not cold, just 2 people who'd learned something hard from each other and had both, apparently, come out the other side of it slightly better for it. She hugged me and told me the restaurant build-out contract was already signed, another $180,000 job, starting in June. I stood in the middle of that lobby, under $200,000 of steel my own hands had helped shape, surrounded, imperfectly, incompletely, but genuinely, by the people I loved, and thought about how far away that felt from a kitchen table 10 years earlier, where a woman with a pen and a crossword puzzle had told me other people's children were doing better things. By June, Lang Ironworks had moved into an actual office, small, 2 rooms above the shop floor, but ours, with a proper reception desk for Priya, a conference table, and a wall of framed photographs documenting every major project since year 1, ending with a shot of the ironclad's mezzanine at golden hour. On the shelf by the window, catching the afternoon light, sat the crystal I-beam trophy. It threw thin rainbows across the wall whenever the sun hit it right, and more than once I caught myself watching them instead of working, which felt like an acceptable use of 5 minutes of any given afternoon. We were 6 months into what was shaping up to be our biggest year yet. $3.1 million projected revenue, 18 employees, 4 active projects including a second historic conversion downtown that had come to us because the developer had toured the ironclad and asked point blank, "Who did the steel?" and been handed my card before he'd even finished the sentence. My mother called on a Thursday afternoon in June. Not a Sunday, a Thursday, 2:20 p.m., which by that point had become, without either of us saying so out loud, just another normal day for her to call. Not an emergency, not a rehearsed script, just an ordinary check-in, the kind other families probably take for granted their whole lives without ever noticing how rare it actually is. "Hey, Mom." Hi, sweetheart. How are you? Good. Just got back from a site walk. What's up? Nothing urgent. I just wanted to hear your voice. A small pause. How's the Cherry Creek job going? The one your father won't stop talking about. I smiled at that, alone in my office, looking out at the front range still holding a little snow on the highest peaks even in June. Good. We're framing the atrium roof next week. Should be a beautiful piece once it's up. Full steel and glass skylight 30 feet across. That sounds incredible, she said, and I could tell, in a way I'd learned to tell over the last 7 months, that she actually meant it. That the sentence wasn't a placeholder on the way to somewhere else. Your father wants to know if we could come by and watch when they lift it into place. He said something about wanting to see a crane in action, which I think is really just an excuse to come see you work. Yeah, I said. I'd like that. I'll text you the date once I have it confirmed. We talked for almost 20 minutes. She asked real questions about permits, about whether the atrium glass had arrived yet, about how Ruby was doing, whether the scholarship program had picked its next round of recipients. I answered without any of the old guardedness, without measuring my sentences down to fit inside the size of box she used to leave for me. It still felt strange sometimes, this new shape of talking to my mother. Strange and new and good. The way anything genuinely healing tends to feel a little unfamiliar, even while it's happening. I should let you get back to it, she said finally. Love you, sweetheart. Love you too, Mom. I hung up and sat there for a moment, phone still warm in my hand, and let myself feel the specific, quiet satisfaction of an ordinary phone call that, a year earlier, would have been unthinkable. That evening, I sat in my truck in the shop parking lot after everyone else had gone home. Windows down, radio off, watching the sky go orange and then pink over the mountains. Through the office window above me, I could see the trophy on the shelf, catching the last of the light. I thought about Thanksgiving, 7 months earlier, the phone call, the careful, apologetic voice explaining that I wasn't welcome at my own family's table. The quiet devastation of understanding, all at once, that the people who were supposed to know me best had built an entire version of who I was out of nothing but assumption and discomfort. I thought about the gala, the moment my name got called and I looked up to find my own family 60 feet away, ambushed by a truth they should have already had. I thought about the parking garage, my mother's mascara smudged at the corner of one eye, Connor standing back, unable to close the distance. I thought about the coffee with Bree, the coffee with my mother, my father in the shop running his hand along a railing like he was trying to physically understand what his daughter did with her days. I thought about Christmas, the lumpy mashed potatoes, my brother asking for the first time in his life how a mezzanine gets built. They hadn't fixed everything. We weren't a finished project, any more than any building ever really is. There's always another season of maintenance, another thing that needs rechecking, another weld that needs a second look. Connor and I still talked less than most siblings, still had years of flatness between us that a handful of good conversations wasn't going to fully repair on its own. My mother still occasionally asked a question that revealed exactly how little she'd once understood about the shape of my life, though now, at least, she asked it because she genuinely wanted the answer, not because it was a box she needed checked before the conversation could move on to something else. But they were trying, actually trying, in the slow, imperfect, showing up anyway way that real change tends to look like, which is almost never as clean as it sounds when you tell the story afterward. And for the first time in a decade, trying was enough, because I'd finally stopped needing them to get it perfect in order to let them back in. I used to think I was building buildings, structures, staircases, mezzanines, skylights, steel bent and welded into shapes that would outlast every person who ever admired them. It took me most of a decade to understand that I was actually building something else the entire time, underneath all of it. Proof. Proof that I was worth a real question instead of a polite one. Proof that "how's work?" was never going to be enough, and that I didn't have to accept it as enough just because it was easier for everyone else not to look closer. I don't need that proof for them anymore. Not the way I used to. I know what I built, and I know what it cost. And I know exactly how much of it I built without a single person in that family cheering me on, which is its own kind of foundation, the kind that doesn't crack the first time someone else's belief wavers. But I'll keep building anyway. The company, the scholarship, whatever comes after both of those. Because I love the work itself. The specific, unglamorous satisfaction of taking raw material that doesn't want to hold a shape and making it hold one anyway, permanently, through nothing but patience, heat, and a steady hand. And that slowly, in fits and starts, over breakfast diners and shop floor tours and one very public awards gala neither of us saw coming, is the part my family is finally starting to understand too. I started the truck. The radio came on mid-song, something with a steel guitar and a chorus about small towns and hands that know how to build things, and I pulled out of the lot and drove home with the windows still down, the last of the June light going gold and then gray behind me in the rearview mirror. They didn't invite me to Thanksgiving because they were ashamed of who I'd become. Now my father asks to watch the crane lift steel into place, and my mother keeps a newspaper clipping in her kitchen drawer, and my brother asks real questions about mezzanines at a table with a water ring that never came out. It took a public reckoning and 600 strangers in a hotel ballroom to get us here. I would not have chosen that path if there had been an easier one available. But there wasn't, and this is the one we got, and we're still standing on it, together, which is more than I would have bet on 8 months ago. And for now, at least, that's enough. I should back up further than the trade school decision because I don't think that choice came out of nowhere, even though it looked that way to my parents at the time. It came from my grandfather, my mother's father, a man named Walt Kowalski, who ran a small blacksmith and general repair shop in Pueblo for 41 years before he retired, and who died when I was 14, 3 years before I would have been old enough to properly apprentice under him, which is a loss I still feel more than almost any other in my life. I spent every summer of my childhood at that shop. My mother would drop me off for 2, sometimes 3 weeks at a time while she and my father worked, and I'd spend my days sitting on an overturned bucket in the corner of Walt's shop, watching him work a forge, watching him take a shapeless piece of raw iron and, through nothing but heat and repeated, patient blows, turn it into a hinge, a gate latch, a fireplace poker with a handle shaped like a horse's head that I still own, that sits on my desk at Lang Ironworks to this day. He let me pump the bellows starting when I was 6. He let me hold the tongs, under close supervision, starting when I was 9. By 12, he was letting me strike simple pieces myself under his direct instruction, and I remember, with a clarity that has never faded, the exact feeling of the first time I flattened a piece of hot steel into a shape I'd actually intended, instead of just an accident of force. It felt like the entire world had gotten quieter and louder at the same time. Most people, Walt told me once, sweat running down into his collar, setting a finished piece into the water trough to quench, the steam hissing up around both of us. Spend their whole lives afraid of heat. They think it only destroys things. It doesn't. Heat is the only thing that can make iron listen. You just have to know how much and for how long, and when to stop and let it cool into what it's going to be. I didn't understand, at 12, that he was telling me something about more than metal. I understand it now. My mother, growing up, watched her own father come home every night with burns on his forearms and soot under his fingernails. And she decided, somewhere in her own 20s, that this life, smoke and heat and hard, physical, underappreciated labor, was something to escape, not something to carry forward. I think, if I'm honest and generous about it, that some of her discomfort with my choice wasn't really about me at all. It was about her own father, about a life she'd watched be genuinely hard on someone she loved, and about a fear that I was choosing to walk directly back into the same fire she'd spent her whole adult life trying to put a safe distance between herself and. I didn't understand that until the coffee shop conversation, 7 months after the gala, when she said the thing about being scared of what she'd find out if she asked real questions. It wasn't only about me being happier than she was. It was about Walt, too, underneath it. A grief she'd never fully processed, dressed up as caution about my career. I told her that once, gently, on a Sunday about 2 months after that first coffee. I think about Grandpa Walt every single day at the shop, I said. Not as a warning, as a reason. He's the whole reason I know what heat can build, instead of just what it can destroy. She cried a little at that, quietly, at her own kitchen table, and told me she wished she'd said his name to me more, growing up, instead of treating that whole part of her life like something to keep folded up and put away. I think I was scared that if I let you get close to that world, I'd lose you to it, the way I sort of lost him to it, she admitted. He was always at that shop. Even when he was home, some part of him was still there. I'm not lost to it, Mom, I said. I found myself in it. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always look different from the outside. She nodded, slow, like she was turning the horsehead poker over in her mind the way I still sometimes turn the actual object over in my hands. Not every part of the last 5 years has been triumphant, and I don't want to tell this story as though the only obstacle standing between me and success was my own family's silence. The industry itself has its own version of that silence, dressed up differently, and I ran into it more times than I can count. There was a client in year 3, a developer named Rick Fassbender, mid-50s, building a mixed-use retail strip in Aurora, who spent our entire first walkthrough addressing every question to Tomas, even after I'd introduced myself as the company owner, even after I'd been the one to answer 3 separate structural questions in a row with more technical precision than anyone else on site that day. "So when can I talk to the guy who actually runs things?" he said, near the end of the walkthrough, not even bothering to lower his voice, standing 4 feet from me. Tomas, to his enormous credit, said nothing, just looked at Rick, and then looked at me, waiting, the way he always did in moments like that, for me to decide how I wanted to handle it, because he trusted me to handle it, which mattered more to me in that moment than almost anything else that happened on that job. "You're talking to her," I said. "I am Sadie Lang. I own Lang Ironworks. I signed the contract you're standing on right now, and I'm the one who's going to be personally liable if this steel package comes in late or over budget, which it won't because I don't let that happen. Tomas is my lead fabricator, and he's forgotten more about ornamental steel than most people in this industry ever learn. But the buck stops with me, not him." Rick's face went through about 4 visible stages of recalculation. He apologized, sort of, in the clipped, non-apology way certain men apologize when they're more embarrassed about being caught than genuinely sorry for the assumption itself. We finished the project. It came in on time, slightly under budget, and Rick referred exactly 0 clients to me afterward, which I've always taken as a kind of confirmation that I'd read him correctly the first time. I tell that story not because it was the worst version of that moment. There have been worse, cruder, more openly dismissive versions of it over the years, from clients and from other contractors, and, memorably, from a building inspector in year 2 who spent an entire site visit talking exclusively to my then only employee, a 20-year-old apprentice with 11 months of experience, rather than address a single question to me. But because it's the version that taught me the most. It taught me that credibility, in this industry, doesn't arrive once and then stay. You re-earn it constantly, in ways your male peers simply don't have to. And the exhausting, repetitive nature of that re-earning is its own kind of tax that never shows up on any invoice, but gets paid every single week regardless. It's part of why the CMTA award mattered to me more than I let on in that acceptance speech. More than I've fully admitted to almost anyone except Tomas and, much later, Ruby. It wasn't just personal validation. It was external, public, unambiguous proof that sat in a room with 600 witnesses. The kind of proof that doesn't have to be relitigated every time a new client walks onto a job site and looks past me toward whichever man happens to be standing nearby. In March, the trade school where I'd trained a decade earlier, the same welding and fabrication program on Santa Fe Drive, asked me to come speak to the current cohort. I said yes before I'd even fully thought through what I wanted to say, because I remembered exactly what it had felt like to sit in that same building at 23, surrounded by people who mostly look like me in one specific way: determined, underestimated, quietly furious at a world that kept implying they should have picked something else. I stood at the front of a classroom that smelled almost exactly the way it had a decade earlier: hot metal, cutting oil, the particular mustiness of a building that had been an industrial space long before it became a school, and looked out at maybe 30 students, a mix of ages, a handful of women scattered through the room, one of whom I recognized as Ruby's cousin, the scholarship recipient, sitting in the second row with her arms crossed in a posture I recognized instantly because I used to wear it myself. 10 years ago, I sat in a room almost exactly like this one, I told them, and told my family I was choosing this instead of a business degree, and the reaction I got was somewhere between confusion and disappointment. I'm not telling you that story so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I want you to understand something before you leave this building. The people who love you do not always have the imagination to picture the life you're capable of building. That's not always malice. Sometimes it's just a limit on what they've personally seen work before. Your job is not to make them see it before you start. Your job is to build it whether they see it yet or not. The seeing usually comes later, if it comes at all, and you cannot let it be the thing your effort depends on. I told them about Walt and the forge. I told them about the 11-week freeze on the Englewood job, about the legal pad, about almost losing Danny's job and not sleeping for most of a season. I told them about Rick Fassbender asking to talk to the guy who actually ran things. I told them about the gala, the reveal, the parking garage, because I'd decided, standing there, that the sanitized version of the story, the one that skips straight from hard work to trophy, does a disservice to every person in that room who was going to need the messier, truer version far more than they needed a highlight reel. Afterward, Ruby's cousin came up to me, still a little shy, and asked how I'd known, at 23, that it was going to be worth it. I didn't, I told her. I still don't always know, some weeks. You don't get certainty as a reward for choosing the harder path. You get it, maybe, a decade later, Standing in a shop you built, looking back at all the specific days you didn't know if it was going to work. The certainty comes after, if it comes at all. Before that, you just have to be willing to keep showing up without it. She nodded slowly, and I recognized again that exact expression. The one that means someone has just heard a sentence they're going to carry around for a long time, turning it over the way you turn over a piece of hot steel, waiting to see what shape it's going to settle into. It would be a mistake to tell this story as though the only relationships that mattered were the ones I had to fight for. There were people the whole time who never once needed convincing, and I think they deserve their own place in this story, because family isn't only the people you're related to by blood. My closest friend since trade school is a woman named Priya Desai, not the bookkeeper, a different Priya, a coincidence that has caused more scheduling confusion in my life than I care to admit. We met in the very first week of the program on Santa Fe, both of us the only women in a welding fundamentals class of 19. Both of us seated at adjacent stations, mostly because the instructor put us there and neither of us questioned it. She went on to specialize in pipe welding and now runs her own small crew doing industrial fabrication work, mostly out of state on pipeline maintenance contracts, which means we don't see each other often, but when we do, there's a specific kind of shorthand between us that I've never quite found with anyone else. Priya was the first person I called after that Thanksgiving phone call from my mother, before I'd even taken my work jacket off. She listened to the entire thing without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "You know this isn't about your job, right? This is about a decade of them never bothering to understand what your job even is. If you told them you were a welder and then never built a single thing worth noticing, this would still have happened, because the disinterest came first. The excuse just showed up when they needed one." She was right. And hearing her say it out loud, plainly, without softening it, was more useful to me in that moment than any amount of gentle reassurance would have been. She was also the one who took me dress shopping for the gala 2 weeks before the event, once I'd finally admitted I was going and needed something that wasn't a Carhartt jacket. We spent an entire Saturday in and out of stores in Cherry Creek, both of us feeling faintly ridiculous, both of us more comfortable in a welding shop than a department store fitting room, laughing so hard in the third store that a sales associate came to check on us. "You look like you're about to go accept an Academy Award," Priya said, when I came out in the black dress I eventually bought, the one I wore to the gala. "Not an Ironworkers Award, an actual Oscar." I feel ridiculous. "You look like someone who built a company out of a used truck and a folding table," she said more seriously. "Wear it like that's what it is, because it is." She couldn't make the gala itself. She was 3 states away on a job that week, but she called me at 6 a.m. the morning after, the second she saw the Denver Business Journal piece shared online, and I answered, still half asleep, and she just said, I told you to wear it like that's what it was." And I could hear, even through the phone, that she was crying a little, proud in a way that had absolutely nothing complicated wrapped around it, nothing to untangle, nothing to earn. It had just always been there, unconditionally, the entire time. And I think I needed that specific kind of uncomplicated support more in that stretch of my life than I let myself admit, because so much of my energy for a full decade had gone into a family relationship that required constant, careful management. There's a lesson in that too, one I didn't fully understand until much later. The people who never made me prove anything were the people I sometimes took most for granted, precisely because they were easy, because loving them back didn't require strategy or boundary setting or carefully worded emails with numbered terms. I've tried, since the gala, to be more deliberate about showing up for Priya the way she's always shown up for me. Driving out to see her crew's finished pipeline section when she invited me. Calling just to hear her voice on ordinary Thursdays, the same way my mother eventually learned to call me. I haven't told the part of the nomination story that happened before the email in September. The part that actually explains how a nomination becomes a finalist selection. Because I skipped straight to the notification the first time through. The way you skip to the ending of a story you already know the shape of. In late August, 2 weeks before I got that email, a small delegation from the CMTA Awards Committee, 3 people, 2 men and a woman, all veterans of the trade, all serious in the specific unhurried way that people get after decades of doing physically demanding, precise work, showed up at the ironclad site unannounced, badges from the association clipped to their jackets, to see the work in person before finalizing the shortlist. I didn't know at the time what they were there for. I assumed at first they were another set of potential clients and treated the visit accordingly, walked them through the mezzanine framing, explained the load calculations on the exposed truss system, answered every question about material sourcing and weld inspection protocols without a hint of performance, because I genuinely believed I was talking to people evaluating whether to hire me for something else entirely. It was only near the end, when the woman on the committee, a longtime shop owner from Fort Collins named Carol Jessup, asked if she could see my weld logs and inspection records for the project, that I started to suspect this was something different. "We do this for every finalist before the committee votes," she told me, once she'd confirmed I hadn't guessed the real purpose of the visit. "Anyone can talk a good game in an interview. We want to see the actual work, unstaged, on an active site, talking to a crew that doesn't know we're coming. It tells us more in 20 minutes than any application essay could." She flipped through my inspection binder for a long time, asking sharp, specific questions about a section where we'd had to re-weld a joint after a third-party inspector flagged insufficient penetration. A real mistake, caught and corrected, documented honestly rather than buried. "Most people would leave that out of the binder they show a stranger," she said. "I don't run a shop where mistakes get hidden," I told her. "We catch them, we fix them, we document them so it doesn't happen twice. That's the whole system." She wrote something in a small notebook, thanked me, and the 3 of them left without telling me anything about where I stood. I didn't think about that visit again until the nomination email arrived 2 weeks later. And even then, I didn't connect the 2 events until Carol Jessup found me at the gala after-party months later, glass of wine in hand, and told me, laughing, "You have no idea how close we came to walking off that site without telling you anything, and you'd have spent 2 more weeks assuming we were just another difficult potential client who never called back." I think about that unannounced visit often, now, whenever I'm tempted to clean something up before showing it to someone, to present a more polished version of the work than the honest one. Carol Jessup didn't nominate me in the end on the strength of a perfect record. She nominated me on the strength of an honest one, mistakes and corrections included. And I've tried to run every part of the company, and increasingly every part of my life outside it, according to that same standard ever since. People ask me sometimes, now, at trade shows, at the scholarship dinners, in the comment sections under the Denver Business Journal piece that somehow still circulates a full year later, whether I regret staying quiet for so long. Whether, if I could go back to that kitchen table at 23, I'd do it differently. Sit my parents down properly, explain the numbers earlier, force the conversation instead of letting a decade of "how's work" slide by unchallenged. I've turned that question over more times than I can count, usually late at night, usually with a beer in hand, sitting on the same porch where, years earlier, I used to sit and calculate whether I could afford another employee's salary. Here's what I've landed on, at least for now, at least as of this telling. I don't think forcing the conversation earlier would have worked, because the problem was never a lack of information. My parents had every fact they needed the entire time. They knew I owned a company. They knew I'd gotten licensed, hired people, bought a house. The information was never the missing piece. The curiosity was the missing piece, and you cannot force curiosity into existence through better explanation. You can only wait and keep building and hope that eventually either the disinterest breaks on its own or you build something too large to keep looking past. I got lucky in a sense, that the thing that finally broke it was a public, undeniable moment instead of a private, deniable one. If Bree hadn't been dating Connor, if the CMTA committee hadn't happened to choose me as a finalist that particular year, my parents might have gone on for another decade asking Connor about his bonus and asking me how work was, and I might have gone on quietly accepting it as the shape of the relationship. The way you accept a draft coming from under a door you've stopped noticing because you've lived with it too long. I don't wish that on anyone, honestly. Needing a public reckoning to get seen by your own family shouldn't be the mechanism required. And it isn't fair that it so often is, especially for people in this industry, especially for women in this industry, who already carry the extra tax of constantly reproving credibility everywhere else in their working lives. If I could change one thing about how this all unfolded, it wouldn't be anything about my own silence. It would be about theirs. I would go back and hand my 23-year-old mother a different question to ask her daughter at that kitchen table. Not why welding, not a comparison to Diane's daughter at Duke, but simply, tell me what excites you about it. 4 words. That's all it would have taken to open a different decade entirely. I've started asking Ruby that exact question, deliberately, every few months, because I want her to have a version of mentorship that includes what my family didn't, for as long as I possibly can. What excites you about it? Not how's work, not are you sure? Just tell me what excites you, and then actually listening to the answer, all the way through, without already composing your next sentence about someone else's bonus while she's still talking. The Sunday before I sat down to put all of this into words, almost exactly a year after that first Thanksgiving phone call, we had dinner at my parents' house again, the way we do most weeks now, an ordinary rhythm that no longer feels like something I have to brace myself for. The oak table still has the water ring near the salt shaker. My mother's mashed potatoes are still lumpy. My father still mutes the television during dinner, though these days he mutes it to ask me questions about a new job instead of to avoid an awkward silence. Connor was there with Priya, the one who isn't my bookkeeper, and it was, for the first time in longer than I can remember, an entirely comfortable evening. No performance, no careful management of what could and couldn't be said, no numbered terms hovering silently over the table the way they had, invisibly, for the first several months after the gala. Near the end of the meal, my mother asked, "How's the scholarship program going? Weren't you announcing the new recipients this week?" "2 more start in the fall," I said. "One of them's a single mom, 31, wants to get certified so she can support her kids without having to work 3 jobs to do it. The other one's 19, straight out of high school. Reminds me a little of myself at that age, honestly. Stubborn. Doesn't like being told what she can't do." "Sounds familiar," my father said, and everyone laughed, including me, because it was true, and because for the first time in a decade, that particular truth about myself had stopped being something my family treated as a problem to be managed and had become, instead, just an accurate, affectionately delivered fact about who I am. After dinner, I helped my mother clear the table, the 2 of us moving through the small, practiced choreography of a kitchen we both know by heart. She dried a plate and set it in the cabinet and said, without looking at me. I keep that newspaper article in my kitchen drawer, next to the takeout menus. I heard, I said. Dad told me. I take it out sometimes, she said, just to look at it. Not because I need convincing anymore. I think I just like having proof that I get to be proud of you out loud now instead of quietly the way I used to be. I didn't say anything for a second. Some sentences don't need an immediate response. They just need room to land. I'm glad you kept it, I said finally. Me too, she said, and closed the cabinet, and that was the whole conversation. Small and ordinary and entirely unremarkable to anyone who hadn't lived through the decade it took to get there. I drove home that night with the windows cracked, even though it was cold enough that it probably didn't make sense, just because I wanted the wind on my face for a few minutes. The same wind that used to carry sawdust and weld smoke through the open window of my truck on the drive home from a job site, back when nobody in my family knew or asked what that smell actually meant. They know now. Not everything. Nobody ever knows everything about another person's work, not really. And I've stopped expecting that level of understanding as the price of feeling loved. But they know enough. They ask real questions now, and they wait for the real answers. And some Sundays, that's the whole miracle, wrapped up in something as small and unremarkable as lumpy mashed potatoes and a muted television and a water ring on an old oak table that never came out no matter how many times anyone tried to sand it away. Some things, it turns out, aren't supposed to come out. They're just supposed to become part of the table you keep gathering around anyway. There's a question I get asked constantly now, at every panel, every scholarship dinner, every interview a local paper or trade publication decides to run. Some version of, what would you say to your 23-year-old self sitting at that table, about to tell your parents you were choosing welding over a business degree? I used to give a short answer, something clean and quotable, the kind of sentence that looks good pulled out and printed under a photo. Build anyway. The right people will catch up eventually. It's not untrue, but it's smaller than the real answer, and I've started giving the longer version instead, even though it doesn't fit as neatly on a page. I would tell her this. The disappointment in that kitchen isn't really about you. It feels like it's about you. It feels, at 23, like the most personal rejection imaginable. Like your own mother is looking at the actual shape of who you are and finding it insufficient. But it isn't that, not really. Even when it's dressed up to look exactly like that. It's about a story she already had running in her head before you ever sat down at that table. A story about what a good life looks like, built out of her own father's exhaustion, her own decades of choosing the safe, respectable, understood path over anything riskier. Her own quiet grief for the parts of her life she never let herself imagine could look different. You walked into that story uninvited, carrying a version of yourself she hadn't written the part for. And her first reaction wasn't really about your worth. It was about her own unexamined fear, wearing your decision as a convenient excuse to surface. That doesn't make the sting smaller in the moment. It didn't for me. I sat at that table at 23 and felt, with total certainty, that I had just disappointed the two people whose approval I'd spent my entire childhood organizing myself around. And no amount of later understanding erases how that actually felt in real time, sitting there, watching my mother's pen stop mid-crossword. But understanding it now, a decade later, has changed what I do with that memory. I don't carry it as evidence that I was wrong. I carry it as the first data point in a much longer pattern, one that took years to fully see the shape of, and seeing the shape of it, really seeing it, not just feeling hurt by individual moments inside it, is what eventually let me stop absorbing the blame for a disinterest that was never actually about anything I'd done. I'd also tell her something Tomas told me once, on one of the worst nights of the Englewood freeze, sitting in the shop at 9 p.m. with the lights half off because I was trying to save on the electric bill that month. I'd asked him, half joking, half not, whether he ever regretted staying with a company that couldn't guarantee his hours. "I spent 20 years working for people who barely knew my name," he said. "You know mine. You ask me things nobody ever asked me before, about the actual work, not just whether I finished it on time. I'll take uncertain hours with somebody who sees me over guaranteed hours with somebody who doesn't, every time. That's not loyalty for its own sake. That's just math I've already done." I think about that conversation constantly because it reframed something for me that I hadn't fully articulated yet at the time. That the entire 10-year ache with my family was never really about money or status or even about the specific job I'd chosen. It was about being seen, plainly and specifically, for the actual thing I was doing with my one life, instead of being reduced to a category: construction worker, blue collar, the risky one, that let everyone else stop looking any closer. Tomas gave me that in the workplace before my parents ever managed to give it to me at home. And I think that's part of why the company itself became such a fierce, almost disproportionate source of identity for me during those years. It was the one place, for a long time, where being fully seen wasn't conditional on anything. I'd tell 23-year-old Sadie one more thing, the hardest one. The one I still have to remind myself of some weeks even now. You do not owe anyone a slower, gentler version of your own success just because it makes the people around you more comfortable to watch you arrive at it in real time. I spent years quietly downplaying numbers, softening milestones, saying business is going well instead of naming the actual figure. Partly out of modesty, sure, but partly, I've had to admit to myself, out of a learned instinct to keep myself small enough that my parents' discomfort wouldn't have anywhere obvious to land. I don't do that anymore. When someone asks me how the company's doing, I tell them the real number, the real scale of it, without apology and without the little verbal cushion I used to build around it. It took a public 600-person impossible-to-soften revelation to finally break me of that habit, and I sometimes wish I'd broken it on my own terms, years earlier, in a quiet room instead of a ballroom. But I understand, too, why I didn't. Some habits only come apart under enough pressure, and I'm not going to pretend I would have found that pressure on my own if the world hadn't eventually applied it for me. I don't want to end this without being honest about the anger, because I think stories like this one sometimes get smoothed over on their way to a tidy ending, and the smoothing does a disservice to anyone listening who's living inside their own version of this right now, mid-story, without any guarantee of a gala or a public reveal or a neat resolution waiting on the other side. I was angry for a long time. Angrier than the calm, measured tone of most of this account probably lets on. There were nights, in the weeks after that Thanksgiving call, when I sat in my truck outside my own house and just gripped the steering wheel, furious in a way that had no immediate outlet. Because who do you even direct that fury toward? A mother who genuinely believed she was managing a delicate situation gracefully? A brother who'd spent 5 months constructing a version of me for his girlfriend that made his own life look better by comparison, probably without even fully registering the cost of it to me. There isn't a clean villain in this story, and that lack of a clean villain is, in some ways, harder to sit with than a clear one would have been. It's easier to be angry at someone who did something monstrous. It's much harder to metabolize anger at people who love you, who mean well by every honest measure they'd apply to themselves, and who still managed to spend a full decade failing to see you clearly. I let myself be angry. I didn't rush the forgiveness. And I want to be plain about that, because I think there's a cultural pressure, especially on women, to arrive at grace faster than is actually honest, to perform understanding before you fully processed the hurt underneath it. I did not do that. I let the anger sit for months. I set the 3 terms in that email not from a place of calm, generous magnanimity, but from a place of genuine, hard-won clarity that came only after I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened, instead of skipping straight to the version of the story where everyone gets forgiven quickly because it's more comfortable for everyone involved. I think that's actually the part of the story I'd most want someone in the middle of their own version of it to hear. You don't have to rush to be the bigger person. You're allowed to be angry, for as long as the anger is actually telling you something true, which it usually is. The reconciliation that came afterward, with my parents, with Connor, was real precisely because I didn't skip the angry part to get there faster. It was built on the other side of something honest, not around it. As of this telling, Lang Iron Works employs 21 people. We're on pace to close the year north of $3.4 million in revenue. We've broken ground on a 3rd historic conversion downtown, a project even larger than the Ironclad, one that will make the mezzanine and staircase work we did there look, in Tomas's words, like practice swings before the real game. Ruby is a full journeyman now, running her own small crew on smaller residential jobs, training her own first apprentice, a 19-year-old kid who reminds her, she told me recently, half laughing, half serious, a little too much of both of us, honestly, in the worst way, which I mean as the highest compliment. The scholarship program has funded 5 students total. 2 have graduated the program and gone on to full-time trade work. One of them works for me now. My father has a standing invitation to watch any structural steel lift on any active job, and he has taken me up on it more times than any reasonable person's schedule should probably allow, which I have never once discouraged, because I remember what it took to get him to look in the first place, and I'm not going to be the one who makes him feel like the looking is no longer welcome. My mother's newspaper clipping still lives in the kitchen drawer next to the takeout menus. There's a second clipping in there now, too. From a smaller piece, the same paper ran about the scholarship program, about the single mother and the 19-year-old and what a company built from one used truck can eventually make room for. Connor and I are not close in the effortless, easy way some siblings manage to be, and I don't know if we ever fully will be. Some kinds of distance, once they've had 10 years to set, don't disappear completely just because the underlying cause got resolved. But we're honest with each other now, in a way we never were before, and honest, I've come to believe, is a sturdier foundation to build the rest of a relationship on than easy ever was to begin with. And I still have the crystal I-beam trophy on the shelf by my office window, still catching the afternoon light exactly the way it did the first week I set it there, still throwing thin rainbows across the wall on the specific afternoons when the sun comes in at just the right angle. I don't look at it as often as I did that first year. I don't need to, the same way I no longer need the newspaper article, the same way I no longer need anyone's applause to confirm what I already know about the last 10 years of my own life. But some days, usually late, usually when the shop's gone quiet and everyone else has driven home, I still catch the light hitting it just right, and I let myself sit with it for a minute before I turn off the office lights and lock up behind me. They didn't invite me to Thanksgiving because they thought I'd embarrass them. I built a company, a scholarship, a shop full of people who see each other, A family relationship that finally asks real questions and waits for real answers. And none of it, not one single weld of it, ever needed their permission to become exactly what it was always going to become anyway. It just took all of us a decade to catch up to that fact, together, at the same table, at the same time. If you're reading this and you recognize some piece of your own life in it, the how's work that never meant anything, the quiet excuse dressed up as practicality, the holiday you got gently, politely uninvited from, I want to say one more thing directly before I let this story close. You don't need a gala. You don't need 600 witnesses, or a crystal trophy, or a stranger's chair scraping back in shock across a ballroom to make your work or your life legitimate. Those things happened to be the mechanism in my particular story, but they are not a requirement. And I'd hate for anyone to walk away from this thinking they need an equivalent public spectacle before they're allowed to demand better from the people who are supposed to love them best. What you actually need is smaller and harder and entirely available to you starting today, whether or not anyone ever nominates you for anything. The willingness to stop shrinking the true size of your own life to keep other people comfortable. The willingness to name, plainly, what real curiosity from the people you love should actually sound like, and to notice, honestly, when you've been quietly accepting something smaller than that for years without calling it what it is. The willingness to let yourself be angry for exactly as long as the anger has something true left to tell you, instead of rushing to forgive on a schedule that serves everyone's comfort but your own healing. I used to think the hardest part of this whole decade was the silence. 10 years of, how's work, instead of a single real question. I don't think that anymore. I think the hardest part was staying. Patiently, honestly, unglamorously myself through all of it, without either performing a smaller version of my life to be accepted, or hardening completely and walking away from people who, it turned out, actually did want to find their way back once they were finally given an honest map. I don't know what the equivalent of my ballroom moment will look like in your life, if it comes at all. Maybe it already has, and you didn't recognize it in the moment, the way I nearly didn't recognize mine until Bree's chair scraped back across that ballroom floor and the whole shape of the evening changed at once. Maybe it's still ahead of you, smaller and quieter than mine, arriving in a coffee shop instead of a hotel ballroom, in a single honest sentence instead of 600 strangers' applause. Either way, keep building. Not for the reveal. Not for the moment someone finally notices. Build because the work is yours. Because the shape you're putting into the world is worth making permanent, regardless of who's watching yet. And let the people who love you catch up whenever they're finally ready to. Some of them will. Some of them won't. But you will still have built something real, either way. And in the end, that turned out to be the only foundation that ever actually held any weight at all. This is Sadie Lang, signing off from the shop floor, where the light's about to go, and there's still one more weld to finish before I lock up for the night.